Welcome again to Adventures in Theater History. Welcome to all our listeners, both old and new. We have been so pleased with the response and the support for this, our second season, with our ongoing theme, Drama is Conflict. We've been covering a lot of fights, riots, and protests in Philadelphia, more than you might think possible for a city, after all, whose moniker literally means brotherly love, but well, there it is. And guess what? There's even more uproars to come. As we move into the early 20th century in the overall narrative, we've also just entered into an era of censorship in American entertainment. And of course, many theater people would fight back against it. And we will get to how that fight over increasing censorship began to affect what appeared and what did not appear on Philadelphia stages in future episodes. But first, we have to take the time today to introduce one of the largest, the most beautiful, and the most impressive theater buildings ever constructed in Philadelphia, a building which would itself eventually play a part in those censorship and public decency disputes. This building, fortunately, is one that, unlike almost every other theater from that era, still stands today. If you're listening in 2023 as I record this podcast, you will know this theater as the popular concert venue called the Met on North Broad Street. After many years of neglect, it's recently been magnificently restored, and it is now run by the huge Live Nation Corporation. And it hosts typically rock, rap, and popular music acts, which is great. And if you're around Philly in the year 1908, however, the year it was constructed, you would have known it as something else. You would have called it Hammerstein's Opera House. And you would also know, since you were likely a devotee of popular theater and classical music of the time, that the city of Philadelphia had suddenly become a new front in the Opera War. Before we go to the war, first, a pleasant little detour. The years of the early 20th century were some of the most prosperous and most dynamic for Philadelphia in terms of theater and everything else. Now, we have talked about how the theatrical syndicate controlled most theater buildings in Philadelphia at the turn of the century, and you would think this might suppress artistic innovation and business practices, and to some extent it did. But I should tell you now that in response to this domination, other things were beginning to happen. During this period, there were 5 new major theater buildings constructed in Philadelphia in what was then the Central Theater District, near City Hall in the blocks along Broad Street. First, the Garrick Theater was built in 1901 by the eccentric millionaire Willis G. Hale, alongside his already extant 1887 7-story Renaissance palazzo. The Hale building, in all its weird and glorious grandeur, is still there. But alas, its younger companion, the Garrick, is not. But in its day, the Garrick Theater had a 230-foot-long lobby leading from the Grand Chestnut and Juniper Street entrance, going all the way back to the auditorium, which was really mostly fronting on Sansom Street to the south. This elegant Garrick Theater was an effort by independent American theater producers and directors such as Richard Mansfield and David Belasco to establish a venue in Philly where they could stage and book prestigious touring legitimate shows, one that were not financially beholden to the theater syndicate. And in time, it was to become one of hometown girl Ethel Barrymore's favorite places to perform in Philadelphia. Not to be outdone, the very next year, the Keith Albee Vaudeville Organization, which was attempting to make its own vaudeville version of the syndicate, built the simply enormous B.F. Keith Theater on Chestnut Street with a huge arch entrance. Now, no expense had been spared by the builders. It was the city's first $1 million theater, proclaimed all the newspapers. The Keith opened with a house policy of continuous vaudeville. That is, it would host all top-of-the-line headliners and entertainers and keep Philadelphians happy with shows that ran continually, back-to-back, from noon until midnight. Next, north of City Hall, were the twin theaters called the Lyric and the Adelphi, built in 1905 and 1907 respectively. These two new buildings, which were intended to house both vaudeville and light musical comedies, also had very large halls, which were formed by digging out space underground, deep into their foundations. These were the first entry of the redoubtable Schubert brothers into the Philadelphia theater market, as they, in their turn, attempted to directly challenge the syndicate in Philadelphia and also all over the country. However, the Schuberts were facing a crisis when Sam S. Schubert, the most dynamic and visionary of this trio of siblings from Syracuse, New York, was killed in a train wreck along with many other people outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania in May of 1905. So in 1907, the remaining two Schuberts, Lee and J.J., called a temporary truce and entered into an interesting arrangement with the syndicate. They jointly invested with them in the Forest Theater, which they built together and named after the great Philadelphia actor, of course. Now, the Forest Theater was built with an entrance at Broad and Sansom, facing right out onto Broad Street. Again, with a long lobby that reached the auditorium way back in the middle of the city block. The Forest Theater eventually became the premier Philly venue for the touring, glitzy musical comedies and the revues of the 19 teens and 20s, including those of Florenz Ziegfeld and George White. But who exactly was filling the seats in all these theaters, along with all the old ones we've already talked about so much on this podcast? Why? Everybody. Even more than New York, perhaps, wrote one proud local journalist. Philadelphia was a great theater-going city. Everybody, if they had time, went out in the afternoon to see shows, from the lowest burlesque houses to vaudeville entertainments, and they might go out again in the evening to see legitimate plays and the great productions of opera that were staged at the Academy of Music on Tuesday evenings during the season. And there was lots of money available to be spent in those theaters, evidently. Here, as elsewhere in the U.S., manufacturing was booming. Immigration and high birth rates swelled the population. New homes and factories were spreading out to the very far edges of the capacious Philadelphia county. And the department stores, the textile mills, the breweries, the ironworks, the locomotive manufacturers, the shipyards, hat factories, chemical plants, oil refineries, slaughterhouses, newspapers, magazines, and publishing firms all served to build the fortunes of the great Philly families, whose names you might still recognize: the Wanamakers, the Clothiers, the Cramps, the Strawbridges, the Baldwins, the Pughs, the Waitmans, the Cressets, the Wyeths, and the Curtises. These joined the names of the old Philly aristocracy who were still around: the Biddles, the Peppers, the Drexels, and the Chews. Oh, the newspapers would all breathlessly report on who was there and what the ladies were wearing as they arranged themselves in the boxes by wealth, taste, and status. There were also transportation fortunes. New streetcar lines crisscrossed the city to serve the public, and these served to build the fortunes of such Philly captains of industry as William Elkins and his partner Peter Widener, who had built huge mansions near each other along North Broad Street, and their families went to the opera too, of course, as did the Cassots, whose patriarch ran the ever-expanding Pennsylvania Railroad. The Pennsylvania Railroad, in fact, was invading New York, tunneling right under the Hudson River and creating the great terminus and cathedral-like Pennsylvania Station on the west side of Manhattan, just to the south of 34th Street. And finally here, we get back to some real theater history, because the construction of this great new railroad station led one of New York's great theater men, Oscar Hammerstein, to decide to build a new opera house nearby this new rail terminus. This, he thought, would be the way best to oppose his enemy, the Metropolitan Opera up on Broadway and 37th. Okay, so at last, we're back to the opera war. So, speaking of empire buildings, here's another one. Oscar Hammerstein was one of the greatest figures in the theater world of his day in the late 19th, early 20th century. If you want to search for more about him online, make sure to type a Roman numeral 1 after his name, so you don't get an article instead about his much more famous today grandson. Of course, there's actual books. If you want to know the whole story about Oscar, I can't recommend enough Vincent Sheehan's 1956 biography. And this book opens, by the way, with a short essay from Oscar Hammerstein II. And that's the Oscar Hammerstein you likely all thought of when I said his name, the Broadway writer, the lyricist of Showboat, and together with Richard Rodgers, also of Oklahoma and South Pacific and The King and I and The Sound of Music. But that's not the guy we're talking about today. We're talking about his grandfather, the original Oscar Hammerstein. This was the man who was famous in his day, and everybody knew his particular image. He had a look. He always wore a tall silk top hat on his head, and a cutaway coat, and a finely trimmed goatee, and he always had a fat cigar stuck in his mouth. Oscar Hammerstein was an immigrant from a well-off German Jewish family in Berlin, and he had run away from home and his oppressive father at the age of only 15 and had arrived in New York in 1863. Ever since then, he had scrambled his way through life, making and losing enormous fortunes as he went. He was wildly talented at most everything he turned his hand to. He started tobacco trade newspaper. He wrote compositions and operettas. He invented dozens of machines for cigar manufacturing. He was a great real estate speculator. He was a theater designer. He was a producer, and he was a great public relations man. He made one vast fortune just from the theater business alone. The Victoria Theater, the theater which was really the first Times Square theater at the corner of Broadway and 42nd Street, just poured money into his pocket for years. But then, this very same Oscar Hammerstein was also, in some sense, a failure at everything he turned his hand to, because whatever money he had made at all those other things, he eventually lost it. That was because of his one overriding passion in his life, some might say his obsession. Because more than his family, more than his money, more than his own personal comfort, he loved opera. And if you know anything about the economics of opera, you know that, historically speaking, opera is all about spending money, huge amounts of money. You have to pay huge salaries, create huge sets, pay huge orchestras, hire big choruses, make the finest costumes. You expect to lose money staging opera. That's why it's always underwritten and subsidized by big entities or national governments or by very, very rich people. But Oscar Hammerstein, he always tried to go it alone, on his own dime. He deliberately insulted and pushed away rich funders who came to him and wanted to help him, and he only thought wanted to control him or compromise his artistry. The mercurial and impulsive Oscar Hammerstein, much to the dismay of his two intensely loyal and calmly competent sons, Arthur and William Hammerstein, loved above all running opera companies, getting his name in all the papers, the big drama of it, making curtain speeches on opening night, paying top salaries to all the great opera singers of his day, especially if he could use these contracts to compete against and destroy his great enemy, the Metropolitan Opera Company. Now, what was behind this feud, we won't go into here, but this was the opera war you would hear about in the headlines back then. And the stakes were, who would be the preeminent company in New York, the biggest city in America, home to some of its greatest fortunes, the Morgans, the Astors, the Vanderbilt. Oh, society matrons, critics, musicians, journalists, and just plain devoted opera fans all joined in the fray. Oscar Hammerstein loved to build opera houses too. That was part of the way he was conducting his war, by building better places to hear and to see opera. Better than the dark and cavernous old Met, he thought. And in the course of his lifetime, he personally financed, designed, and built 5 of them. as well as other theaters. And now, he didn't build these for the money that they would bring in necessarily. His very first opera house up in Harlem didn't even have a box office in its original design. He forgot about it. But when they were all finished, what he really wanted to do was to sit in the wings of an opera house that he had just built, quietly perched on a plain kitchen chair, a cigar stuck in his mouth, watching the performance and drinking in the sound of all the glorious music that he had brought to life. In the year 1907, Oscar Hammerstein was riding high for the moment. His company, the Manhattan Opera, was the toast of New York. It was performing in a space that he himself had designed, this one near Pennsylvania Station. To counter the influence of the Met's new big star, the Italian tenor Enrico Caruso, Hammerstein had managed to secure the services of the soprano Nellie Melba, the Australian prima donna assoluta, who was now performing for Hammerstein in such standards as Verdi's La Traviata. Now, this was an astounding coup. There was no one to match the grand tones and great reputation of Nellie Melba back in the day, except perhaps, maybe, Caruso, and certainly, maybe, Mary Garden, the diminutive Scots soprano with a huge voice and the enormous acting talent who was the queen of the Paris opera scene. Hammerstein also got Mary Garden under contract to perform in these new and exciting and slightly risque French-language operas that were all the rage back then. Oh, in terms of box office and critical opinion, Hammerstein was killing his rivals over at the Met. So the Met countered with two measures. First, it brought exclusive rights to perform Puccini's La Bohème in New York and refused to let Hammerstein ever produce it. And then it arranged to bring over the great Italian composer of that work, Giacomo Puccini himself, to come to America and to personally supervise all productions of his operas at the Met, including his most recent one, called Madama Butterfly, which had its premiere in New York on Friday, February 11th. And it then moved that whole show, singers, crew, cast, chorus, sets, everything, put it on a train and took it down for the Tuesday night show in Philadelphia on Valentine's Day, February 14th, at the Academy of Music. The American soprano Geraldine Farrar was booked to sing the role of Cho-Cho-san, and the great Italian tenor, again, Enrico Caruso, played her faithless husband, Lieutenant Pinkerton. Now, not only did all the grandees and the wealthy of the Quaker City throng to see this, all week long, the Italian population of South Philadelphia had been besieging the Academy's box office, hoping to hear their national hero sing in person. Let's let Philadelphia journalist John Francis Marion, who wrote about this event in his 1984 book about the Academy of Music called Within These Walls, take up the story. Quote, Giacomo Puccini, the composer who had come from Italy with Signora Puccini, and John Luther Long, the American author on whose story the opera was based, were in the Academy to hear the tragic tale unfold. The two men attempted to fraternize, but as neither was comfortably at home in each other's language, not much was accomplished. The evening was a brilliant triumph in every way. The beautiful Geraldine Farrar, in the title role, sang with a radiant beauty of voice and with surprising fluency and command of nuance, and her acting denoted a keen sense of unusual tragic opportunities her dominating role afforded. Caruso's share of the evening seemed on the whole rather incidental. So, it was on. In March of 1907, Oscar Hammerstein made his move, bringing his Manhattan Opera Company down to play the Academy of Music as well. If the Met could do it, so could he. And for this visit, he brought along his great star, the coloratura soprano Luisa Tetrazzini, in Donizetti's opera Lucia di Lammermoor, with its great mad scene aria. And it, too, was a huge success in an era when grand European opera was still popular music. People just could not get enough of it. They were mad for it. Philadelphians were spoiled by the variety and the wealth of the offerings that came their way as a result of this opera war. In fact, over the course of the subsequent 1907-1908 season, despite the fact that there was a financial panic and then a subsequent financial depression going on, it is estimated that Philadelphians spent $150,000 on opera tickets alone. Again and again, the streets around the Academy were jammed as hopeful patrons packed the entrances and besieged the box office. There just wasn't enough room in the grand old theater, and this was a fact that was not lost on Oscar Hammerstein, who quietly began to tour about Philadelphia, scouting for new places where he might build yet another opera house of his own. He was especially looking in North Philadelphia, where he noticed the broad city blocks and the easy access to railroad lines looked very promising indeed. On March 26, 1908, Hammerstein was back again. He had engaged Mary Garden to repeat her performance of this new French opera, Louise, by the composer Gustave Charpentier. Again, the response from the public was huge. People were paying up to $25 a ticket. In all the boxes of the Academy, extra chairs had been jammed in, and nearly every Philadelphian of social distinction was present. At the end of the show, the diva took her final bows, and then she led Oscar Hammerstein out onto the stage and left him there, all alone, as all eyes fell upon him. To a hushed crowd of thousands of Philadelphians, Hammerstein announced, "After the reception of this past week, I concluded that you wanted me. Last fall, I purchased a property at the corner of Broad and Poplar Streets, on which I propose to erect an opera house as fine as those in Berlin, Paris, Vienna, and other European capitals. I have submitted to the city's building department a plan for one of the grandest edifices ever devoted to musical art, in which 4,000 persons would be in a house in which rich and poor alike can enjoy the performances. The dream of my life will be realized if I erect a monument to music which shall endure, only to add culture and delight to this city of yours. I hope in a year from now you will all be pleased. On November 15th, I will open my new opera house." Of course, in his own mind, Hammerstein secretly dreamed that this would just be the first in a string of opera houses that he would one day build all across the country: Cleveland, Chicago, Atlanta, San Francisco. Like I said, by nature, he was an empire builder. But this first one, this new Philadelphia Opera House, well, this would simply dwarf all the other ones we've mentioned already, with a house of 4,000 people. This was bigger than the Manhattan Opera House, and of course, bigger than the Grand Old Academy of Music. And he wanted to do it in only 7 months. Hammerstein, as we said, was always in a hurry. But there would be lots of work to do, and fast, and that is why, just a week later, on April 1st, 1908, on the corner of Broad and Poplar Streets, a riot broke out. Now, when I started researching this episode, I swear I did not know there was going to be another Philly riot in it. The voices in my head keep saying to me, "Every show you got a riot, Peter. I swear to God, you think we do nothing else here?" Well, yeah, but I looked there in the newspaper archives, and there it was, so I have to talk about it. So here we go. Hammerstein had bought a large lot, the size of an entire end of a city block, and it had lots of open gardens, and it had a large building already on it. This was the gracious Italianate mansion that had once belonged to the late Charles J. Harrah, a Philadelphia steel maker. To get this whole project started. The Harra Mansion needed to be immediately demolished, and an enormous hole needed to be dug for the foundations of the new building. We've mentioned that there was an economic downturn at the time, and 2,000 unemployed Philadelphia laborers had shown up at this job site, desperately hoping to be hired for all the work. Most of these Philly men apparently were African American or Irish, but they found when they got there that a gang of Hammerstein's own crack demolition team from New York had already arrived to start to do the skilled part of that job. And then, and here's the breaking point, an additional 100 Italian immigrant laborers had shown up from South Philly with shovels and pickaxes in their hands, offering to do the rough excavation work at very low wages. Now, there was evidently a history of very bad blood between all these various groups, and angry shouting and confrontation soon were happening everywhere you looked. Don't hire the Italians, hire us instead. The police soon had to call out hundreds of officers to the scene, but not before the outnumbered Italians were being chased and assaulted all along Broad Street and in the side alleys of North Philadelphia. Anyone who even looked Italian was being viciously attacked. We have photographs of the chaotic scene, which were published in the papers the next day, along with the predictable headlines that screamed, of course, race riot, because, of course, by the journalistic standards of that day, Italians, Irish, and black people were three entirely different and distinct races. The worst injury, as it turned out, was to one Italian man who had his head bashed in, and he was not expected to live, said the papers. Dozens of other men were arrested before the police could finally quiet things down. But the next day, another disturbance broke out as other enterprising Philadelphians swarmed over the old Harra Mansion, ripping out decorations and taking fine architectural details off the walls and carrying them away. So it was a rather inglorious start to the whole enterprise on the whole. But then, for the rest of the spring and summer of 1908, the Hammerstein crews got things sorted out and work really started in earnest. The entire Harra Mansion was rapidly disassembled brick by brick, and the material was saved to eventually help form part of the walls for the new structure. It wasn't enough because the new building was going to be 10 times the size of the old one. But Oscar's son Arthur, who was highly talented in the building trades, directed all the work personally. Astoundingly, by mid-August, the walls of the new theater were already completed and the roof was going on. The design of this opera house was ostensibly by the firm of William H. McElfatrick, the most experienced theater designer of the day, and they had filed all the official building plans. But everybody knew that the real designer was Oscar Hammerstein himself. Oscar would never entrust his theaters to mere architects. He knew, after all, how to create curves and ceilings and railings that embraced the audience and enhanced and amplified sound. And he knew how to create sweeping balconies with no pillars, posts, or railings to impede the audience's view. And there were always capacious lounges and promenades for the audience to enjoy on their way to and from their seats, as well as roof gardens to visit after the show, and rehearsal rooms for the cast, and an enormous backstage area for the crew. The proscenium was 52 feet wide and 40 feet high. The backstage area stretched 120 feet high, 116 feet wide, and 66 feet to the back wall. There was plenty of room for huge opera sets to fly around and trundle about, and again, this was meant rather as a poke in the eye to the old Metropolitan up in New York, which, due to its rather cramped backstage area, sometimes had to bring its set pieces out onto the street while it was doing a big set change. The outside of the Philadelphia Opera Building was faced with cream-colored brick, with terracotta, and with marble. It had a cornice 75 feet high. Immense cast iron marquees extended out over the sidewalk from the first floor, covering dozens of entrances, doorways all carefully designed to provide easy and quick access to all the various levels and balconies of the new house. And inside, a special line of boxes extended all across the underside of the wide upper balcony section. There was red velvet and gold paint gleaming everywhere, lit by chandeliers and surrounded by galleries filled with statuary. But here's the most incredible thing to me. This whole project was finished exactly when Hammerstein had said it would be, in mid-November, that very same year. And at the same time, he had planned, rehearsed, and prepared the opening night performance and the whole rest of the entire season. The opening night was going to be Georges Bizet's Carmen, starring yet another imported European star, Maria Labia, and pictures of Hammerstein, Labia, and the new opera house were printed in newspapers all over the country. Everybody was watching this opera war. There were stories in Billings, Montana, Portland, Oregon, Los Angeles. The Metropolitan Opera, to counter him, offered Philadelphians Puccini's La Bohème, the one opera that they would not let him do. That very same night, and again, Caruso himself would be singing the role of Rodolfo, and the great Polish soprano, Marcela Sembrich, would be singing Mimi. What were Philadelphians to do? Surely, if they had to choose sides, they would stick with the tried and the true. This was sleepy, old, comfortable Philadelphia, after all, thought the rest of the country. But the real truth was that this was also the unpredictable and the culturally obsessed Philadelphia of 1908. So, people decided to go to both shows. Now, once again, to tell the story, I'm going to quote heavily from the work of John Francis Marion. Here we go. Maestro, music, if you please. At first, there seemed no doubt that the Academy had triumphed. When the curtains rose on Rodolfo's attic room, the Academy's double horseshoe boxes were 3/4 full. Within a short time, every seat was filled, and only the hum of rustling silks and soft satins made gentle accompaniment to the strains of Puccini's music. However, not even Caruso, Scotti, and Sembrich could hold certain of the curious. There was a partial exodus throughout the first act, when those who also held boxes in the new opera house left to discover what was happening at Hammerstein's. And what was happening at Hammerstein's was close to pandemonium. There were 4,000 ticket holders expected in the new house to hear Carmen, and thousands of curious and star-struck people milling around outside. Many of the expected audience were already in place, including out-of-town celebrities like Mr. and Mrs. E.F. Albee and Luisa Tetrazzini, as well as the mayor of Philadelphia and the governor of Pennsylvania and their wives. But a sizable portion of the audience, including the most socially prominent ones, were still downtown, miles away. Back there, the energy slowly dropped inside the old Academy as the audience quietly dwindled. And suddenly, things reached the breaking point, and there were large groups of people all rushing out, climbing into the hastily summoned carriages and automobiles, which all then went together, streaming up Broad Street, circling around the imposing bulk of City Hall in the center square, in a huge convoy, 7 columns of them, in a parade stretching several blocks long. It was the most wonderful sight I have ever witnessed, said a devoted opera patron years later. But when this convoy finally arrived, all these carriages and cars were impeded by this crush of spectators which was standing outside the opera house, all these people eager to see the swells and the richly dressed ladies come and go. There might have been, it is estimated, up to 10,000 people gathered, in fact. And when this huge parade of migrating opera goers from the Academy actually showed up, of course, there was mass confusion. 3 calls for police reinforcements were sent out, reports Marion. Every artery of travel disgorged its hundreds of persons, anxious to see society walk from curb to door. This constantly moving mass was described as no longer being just a crowd, but a dense, unreasonable mob. At last, patrol wagons brought fire ropes to hold the crowd back on the sidewalk. The sloping garden of a home opposite was trampled by the crowd. The police stormed this place twice to drive out the throngs, but no sooner had the squad of bluecoats turned than the natural grandstand again was filled. Finally, all the opera-goers made their way from the cars to the curbs, sent their carriages off, and, due to Hammerstein's numerous and commodious doorways, they got inside, marveling at the glowing interior of their new Philadelphia Opera House. All of them, the Pughs, the Elkins, the Wideners, the Cramps, the Clothiers, the Cassots, the Yarnalls, and the Van Rensselaers found their seats because, of course, the canny impresario Oscar Hammerstein had held the curtain for them, you see, and then the show finally began. The only hitch was, At the last minute, Hammerstein realized that there was no kitchen chair for him to sit in his accustomed spot in the wings, but fortunately, a suitable replacement was found, and he sat down, jammed a cigar in his mouth, and drank in the evidence of his total triumph. At the end of the second act, the stage curtains parted, and there was the New York impresario bowing modestly to his new Philadelphia patrons and making one of his patented gracious speeches of thanks and appreciation, while still challenging Philadelphia to continue to support this great new endeavor that he had brought to them. It is for you to decide, and it is for you to make it the greatest opera house in the world. I have done my part. I promised, and I have fulfilled. I have not come here as a shopkeeper or a producer of opera, wholesale or retail. I have come to ask your aid in promoting great music, which makes us all kin. And when at the end of the season I have artistically completed what I intended to do, call me out again and tell me you are satisfied. As the Public Ledger wrote the next day, quote, "It is not often it can be said with genuine verity that an event marks an epoch. But last night's inaugural performance in the beautiful white structure, now one of the city's chief architectural adornments, was actually the beginning of newer, broader, better things in Philadelphia. It was as if some master magician's wand had called the great, glowing, life-full fabric into being." This was, perhaps, Oscar Hammerstein's finest hour. And there, we'll leave Hammerstein and his opera house in our mind's eye at this moment of triumph, because his fortunes were going to turn. Eventually, this great, glorious enterprise was going to become a millstone around his neck, pulling him down to disaster. I'm Peter Schmitz. Our theme music and sound engineering are by Christopher Mark Colucci. Thank you once again for your kind attention. Please check out our social media feeds on Facebook and Instagram. Visit our website, www.aithpodcast.com, for additional images and blog posts and information, and to listen to other episodes if you need to. Like us and subscribe and review on whatever platform you're using to get your podcast. And you can get extra special info, early releases, and bonus episodes if you become a supporter of the show on Patreon. And if you want to just be in touch, our email is aithpodcast@gmail.com. Join us again, won't you please, in a few weeks' time to hear the rest of this story in the next thrilling episode of Adventures in Theater History, Philadelphia.